The ship lurched against the dock, and Greta Fisher felt her unborn child kick hard against her ribs. She pressed both hands to her swollen belly, 6 months pregnant, and whispered a prayer she didn't believe would be answered. Through the salt-stained porthole, she could see the harbor lights of New York glowing in the winter darkness of 1944. America, the land she had been taught to fear more than death itself. Around her in the cargo hold, 24 other German women clutched their few belongings, their faces hollow with exhaustion and terror. 3 of them were pregnant like Greta. The youngest, barely 19, sobbed quietly into her hands. They had been captured in France, nurses and communications officers serving with the Wehrmacht, swept up in the Allied advance after D-Day. For weeks they had been transported across the Atlantic, crammed into the belly of a Liberty ship, seasick and afraid, whispering rumors that grew darker with each passing day. The rumors had started before they even left Europe. In the transit camp at Southampton, a German officer had pulled the pregnant women aside. His face was grave, his voice low. "You must be strong," he had said. "The Americans will work you until you miscarry. They will take your babies when they are born. They will use you for experiments. This is what they do to their enemies." Greta had wanted to believe he was wrong, that it was just fear talking, but everything she had been taught since 1933 had prepared her for this nightmare. The Reich's propaganda machine had spent over a decade painting America as a land of moral degenerates, a nation of gangsters and capitalists who valued nothing but money and power. Posters in Berlin had shown American soldiers as monsters. Radio broadcasts had described prison camps where captured Germans were starved, beaten, and humiliated. For women, the warnings were even more sinister. The whispers spoke of forced sterilization, of babies ripped from their mother's arms, of medical torture disguised as care. Now, standing in the cramped darkness of the ship's hold, feeling her baby move inside her, Greta was certain she would never hold her child. She'd already decided on a name, Anna, after her mother. She repeated it silently, committing it to memory, because she believed that soon the name would be all she had left. The ship's horn blared, shaking the metal walls around them. American voices shouted orders from the deck above. Heavy boots clanged on steel ladders. Then the door to the hold swung open, flooding the space with harsh electric light. Greta squinted against the brightness, her heart hammering. An American soldier appeared in the doorway, young, barely older than some of the women, with a clipboard in one hand. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Behind him stood 2 women in white uniforms, nurses. One of them stepped forward and spoke in careful, accented German. "Ladies, please gather your things. You will be processed and examined. No one will harm you. You have my word." No one will harm you. The word sounded like a lie, a trick to make them compliant. Greta exchanged glances with the woman beside her, Ilsa, who was 7 months pregnant and could barely stand without help. They had made a pact during the crossing. If the Americans tried to take their babies, they would resist together. They would fight, even if it cost them their lives. But as they climbed the narrow stairs to the deck, something unexpected happened. The cold January air hit Greta's face, clean and sharp, and she saw the harbor spread out before her, not ruins, not devastation. The New York skyline blazed with lights, towers of glass and steel reaching toward the stars. Ships crowded the docks, unloading crates of supplies. Cranes swung through the darkness. Trucks rumbled past, their beds filled with food, equipment, machinery. Everything moved with purpose, with abundance, with an energy that took her breath away. This was not a nation on the edge of collapse. This was not a country struggling to survive. This was power on a scale she had never imagined. The women were led down the gangplank onto American soil. Greta's legs trembled, partly from weeks at sea, partly from fear. Armed guards stood at intervals along the dock, but they did not shout or shove. They simply watched, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. One of them nodded as the women passed, another offered a tired smile. They were loaded into military trucks, canvas-covered benches on either side. As the convoy pulled away from the docks, Greta peered through a gap in the canvas. The city rolled past, block after block of buildings untouched by bombs. Streetlights glowed, cars moved through intersections, people walked on sidewalks, ordinary people, going about their lives as if there were no war at all. The contrast to Germany was devastating. She thought of Berlin, of the rubble-filled streets, the burned-out buildings, the endless nights in bomb shelters. She thought of her mother's last letter, written in November of 1943, describing how they boiled potato peels for soup. The trucks drove for hours, leaving the city behind, heading west through the darkness. Greta dozed fitfully, her head bouncing against the wooden slat behind her. When she woke, dawn was breaking over flat farmland that stretched in every direction. America was enormous. That was the first real lesson. The land went on, empty and vast, more space than she had ever conceived existed. Finally, the convoy slowed and turned through a gate. A sign in English marked the entrance, though Greta could not read it. Later, she would learn they had arrived at a facility in Pennsylvania, a converted army base that now housed female prisoners of war. Barbed wire fences surrounded the compound, but the buildings inside looked solid, newly constructed, with real windows and doors. The truck stopped in front of a long, low building marked with a red cross. The women were told to disembark. Greta climbed down carefully, one hand on her belly, and found herself standing in a line with the others. An American officer approached, a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She introduced herself through the translator as Captain Margaret Brennan, the camp's chief medical officer. "I understand you're frightened," Captain Brennan said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I understand you've been told terrible things about what will happen to you here. I cannot change what you believe with words, but I can show you through our actions. You will be examined, you will be given proper medical care, and those of you who are expecting babies will receive everything you need to carry those children safely to term." Greta wanted to believe her, but the fear was too deep, too ingrained. She thought of the stories, of the rumors, of the officer in Southampton warning them to be strong. They were led inside, one by one, into small examination rooms that smelled of antiseptic and soap. When Greta's turn came, she found herself facing an American doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and steady hands. He gestured for her to sit on the examination table. Through the translator, he explained what he was going to do. Check her heartbeat. Measure her belly. Listen to the baby's heart. "I need you to trust me," he said quietly. "I know that's difficult, but I promise you, I am here to help." He placed a stethoscope against her abdomen, moving it slowly, listening. Then his face broke into a smile. "There," he said. "Do you hear that? Strong and steady. Your baby is healthy." Greta heard it then, the rapid flutter of her child's heartbeat amplified through the stethoscope. Tears blurred her vision. For the first time in months, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. After the examination, the women were taken to a mess hall. The smell hit Greta before she even entered. Food, real food. The tables were laid with trays of scrambled eggs, toast, bacon, and fruit. Pitchers of milk sat at each table, coffee steamed in metal urns. The pregnant women were given extra portions, urged to eat, to drink, to nourish themselves and their babies. Greta sat down and stared at the plate in front of her. It was more food than she had seen in a year, more than her family in Berlin had eaten in a month. She picked up a fork, hesitant, still half convinced this was some kind of cruel joke. But when she tasted the eggs, warm and buttery and real, something inside her cracked open. Ilse sat across from her, tears streaming down her face as she ate. "How?" she whispered. "How do they have so much?" Greta had no answer. She only knew that everything she had been taught was a lie. Over the next few days, the routine of the camp became clear. The women were assigned to barracks, clean and heated, with real beds and blankets. The pregnant women were placed together in a separate section, closer to the medical facility. They were given modified work assignments, light duties like folding laundry or peeling vegetables, nothing that would endanger their pregnancies. They were required to attend daily medical checkups. They were weighed, measured, examined with a thoroughness that was both reassuring and overwhelming. Captain Brennan became a constant presence in their lives. She spoke to them in the mornings, explaining the schedule, answering questions, addressing their fears with a patience that Greta found almost unbearable. The woman treated them not as enemies, but as patients under her care. "You are protected under the Geneva Convention," Captain Brennan explained one morning, addressing the group. "That means you are entitled to medical care equal to what American soldiers receive. It means your pregnancies will be treated as medical conditions requiring special attention. It means that when your babies are born, you will be allowed to keep them, to nurse them, to raise them within the confines of this camp until the war ends and you can return home. The words hung in the air like something impossible. Keep their babies, nurse them, raise them. Greta felt the woman beside her begin to shake with silent sobs. She reached over and took her hand, squeezing hard. Around the room, the other pregnant women sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just been told. Later, alone in her bunk, Greta wrote a letter to her mother. She knew it would be censored, that much of what she wanted to say would be blacked out or removed entirely. But she had to try. "Dearest Mama," she wrote, her hand trembling, "I am alive, and I'm in America. You will not believe me when I tell you this, but I must try. They are treating us with kindness I cannot explain. I am given food, so much food I cannot finish it. The doctors examine me every day and say the baby is strong. They say I may keep my child when it is born. They say they will help me care for it. I do not understand this America, Mama. It is not what we were told. It is nothing like what we were told." She paused, staring at the words on the page, wondering if her mother would think she had lost her mind, wondering if she herself was losing her mind. How could she reconcile the years of propaganda, the images of American brutality, with the reality of a camp doctor who smiled when he heard her baby's heartbeat? How could she make sense of a nation that fed its prisoners better than its own leaders fed their people? The answer, she was beginning to realize, was that she couldn't. The lies had been too complete, the truth too far removed from anything she had been prepared to accept. And yet here she was, 6 months pregnant, sleeping in a heated barracks, eating 3 meals a day, receiving medical care that most German civilians would never see. That night, as she lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, Greta felt her baby kick again. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered the name she had chosen. Anna. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she might actually meet her daughter, that she might hold her, hear her cry, watch her grow. The fear had not disappeared entirely. It still lived in the back of her mind, a shadow that whispered doubts in the darkness. But something else had been planted alongside it, something fragile and dangerous and desperately needed. Trust. Trust, Greta was learning, was built in small moments. It came in the form of a nurse named Dorothy who checked on her every morning, asking how she slept, whether the baby was moving, if she needed anything for comfort. It came in the extra pillow provided without asking when Greta's back began to ache in her 7th month. It came in the way Captain Brennan remembered each woman's name, each due date, each specific concern or fear. By February of 1944, the routine of the camp had become familiar. The pregnant women rose at 7 each morning to the sound of a bell, not a harsh military alarm, but a gentle ringing that allowed them to wake slowly. They dressed in the loose cotton uniforms provided specifically for expectant mothers, designed with expandable waists and comfortable fabric that didn't constrict their growing bellies. In Germany, Greta had worn the same tight uniform throughout her pregnancy, buttons straining, seams splitting. Here, she had 3 changes of clothing, all designed for her changing body. Breakfast was served at 7:30 in the mess hall reserved for female prisoners. The tables were always laid the same way: oatmeal or cream of wheat, toast with real butter, eggs however they wanted them prepared, fresh fruit when available, and always, always milk. The pregnant women received an extra glass each, part of a nutrition protocol that Captain Brennan had explained during their first week. "Your body is building another human being," she had said matter-of-factly. "That requires calcium, protein, vitamins, and calories. The United States Army Medical Corps has determined that pregnant women require a minimum of 3,200 calories per day, with additional supplements of iron and folic acid. You will receive this whether you are a prisoner or not, because the Geneva Convention requires us to maintain your health, and that includes the health of your unborn children. 3,200 calories. The number had seemed impossible at first. Greta remembered the rations in Berlin toward the end of 1943. 1,100 calories per person per day, and that was only if the supply lines held. Her mother's letters had described weeks where they survived on far less. Potato soup, ersatz bread made with sawdust, turnips boiled until they were gray mush. Here, Greta ate until she was full, and still food remained on her plate. Ilse, now 8, months pregnant and moving slowly, had stopped trying to make sense of it. "I've gained 14 pounds since we arrived," she said one morning, her hand resting on her enormous belly. 14 pounds in 2 months. The doctor says this is good, that the baby is growing properly. In Germany, I lost weight while pregnant. I was so hungry I could not sleep at night. The other women nodded. They all had similar stories. Pregnancies back home marked by deprivation, by constant hunger, by the fear that their malnourishment would harm their babies. Here, they were weighed weekly, monitored carefully, and if they lost even a pound, their food portions were immediately increased. After breakfast came the morning medical check. The pregnant women reported to the camp hospital, a proper medical facility with examination rooms, a pharmacy, and even a small laboratory. American military doctors and nurses staffed it around the clock. Greta had initially been terrified of these examinations, convinced they were a prelude to something sinister. But as weeks passed, the routine became reassuring rather than threatening. Her doctor, a soft-spoken man named Lieutenant James Whitmore from Ohio, examined her with a gentleness she had never experienced from German military physicians. He explained everything he was doing before he did it. He asked permission before touching her. He listened when she expressed concerns, taking notes, responding thoughtfully. "Your baby's position is good," he told her in late February, his hands carefully palpating her abdomen. "Head down, which is what we want to see as you enter your 3rd trimester. Heart rate is strong, 140 beats per minute, right where it should be. How are you feeling? Any contractions? Any unusual pain?" Greta shook her head. "Only backache," she said in halting English. She had been learning the language from Dorothy, the nurse who spent her breaks teaching the German women basic medical vocabulary: pain, contractions, nausea, water, help. "Backache is normal," Lieutenant Whitmore said with a smile. "But we can help with that. I'm going to prescribe some gentle exercises, and I'll have the nurses show you how to use heat packs for relief. If it gets worse, you tell us immediately. Understood?" She nodded, feeling tears prick her eyes. This man, this enemy, cared whether her back hurt. He had just spent 15 minutes examining her, making sure she and her baby were healthy, and now he was concerned about her comfort. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. After medical checkups came work assignments. The pregnant women were never given heavy labor. Greta's assignment was in the camp laundry, folding clean sheets and towels, a task she could do sitting down. Other expectant mothers worked in the kitchen gardens during good weather, planting seeds or harvesting vegetables, always under strict orders to avoid strain. One woman, a former accountant named Margaret, who was 5 months pregnant, was assigned to help with camp bookkeeping, sitting at a desk in a heated office. The American approach to pregnant prisoners baffled them all. In the Wehrmacht, pregnancy had been treated as a weakness, something to be hidden or endured in silence. Here, it was treated as a medical condition requiring accommodation and support. Guards reminded them to rest. Nurses checked on them multiple times per day. Captain Brennan had even arranged for the construction of a small day room near their barracks, furnished with comfortable chairs where they could sit with their feet elevated during rest periods. Lunch arrived at noon, another substantial meal. Soup, sandwiches, vegetables, milk, and often dessert. Apple pie, cookies, or pudding, sweets that Greta had not tasted since before the war. The first time she was served chocolate pudding, she had stared at it in disbelief before eating it slowly, savoring each spoonful, trying to make it last. Afternoons brought rest period, a mandatory 2 hours where pregnant women were required to lie down. At first, this had felt like another form of control, but Greta came to appreciate it. By her 7th month, the weight of the baby exhausted her. She would return to her bunk, lie on her side with pillows supporting her belly, and drift into sleep while the winter wind rattled the windows. During these quiet hours, she often thought about the stark arithmetic of her situation. Before capture, serving with a communications unit in France, her daily ration had been perhaps 1,500 calories, sometimes less. She had been constantly tired, perpetually hungry, her skin sallow and her hair brittle. Now, as a prisoner, she consumed more than double that amount. She was healthier as a captive than she had been as a free woman serving her country. The math extended beyond food. The medical care she received was superior to anything available to most German civilians. Back home, hospitals were overwhelmed, medicine scarce, doctors drafted to the front. Her own mother had given birth to Greta in 1922 with only a midwife in attendance, no pain relief, no medical monitoring. Here, Greta would deliver in a fully equipped hospital with trained obstetricians, nurses, and access to whatever interventions might be necessary to ensure both her survival and her baby's. The statistics, when Captain Brennan shared them during a group meeting in March, were stunning. Maternal mortality rates in this camp are less than 1%, the captain announced. Infant mortality is under 2%. These numbers are better than most civilian hospitals in America and significantly better than the rates we're seeing reported from Europe. Less than 1%. Greta tried to reconcile that figure with what she knew of conditions in Germany. In Berlin, maternal mortality had climbed above 5% by late 1943, with infant mortality even higher. Malnutrition, stress, lack of medical care, and constant bombing had turned pregnancy into a life-threatening gamble. Here, behind barbed wire, pregnant enemy aliens were statistically safer than women giving birth in their own homes in the Reich's capital. The relationships between the German women and American medical staff deepened as the weeks passed. Dorothy, the nurse, became particularly close to several of the expectant mothers. She was 26, from a small town in Iowa, cheerful and unflappable. She taught them English phrases, showed them pictures of her own family, and spoke about her hope to have children someday after the war ended. "You remind me of my sister," she told Greta one afternoon while helping her practice breathing exercises for labor. "She's expecting her first baby this summer. I think about her when I take care of you all. I hope someone would show her the same kindness if our situations were reversed." The comment struck Greta deeply. Dorothy saw no enemies here, only pregnant women who needed care. The propaganda had promised that Americans were incapable of such empathy, that they were motivated only by hatred and greed. Yet this young nurse from Iowa spent her days ensuring that German prisoners were comfortable, healthy, and prepared for childbirth. Cultural differences still created moments of confusion. The German women were accustomed to rigid military hierarchy and formal address. The Americans were astonishingly casual. Doctors encouraged the prisoners to call them by their first names. Nurses joked and laughed during examinations, trying to ease tension. Lieutenant Whitmore once brought his young son to the camp during a weekend visit, and the boy had waved shyly at the pregnant women through the hospital window. "That's my daddy," he had said proudly, pointing at Lieutenant Whitmore. "He helps people have babies." Greta had found herself smiling at the simplicity of the child's understanding. Yes, his daddy helped people have babies, even when those people were supposed to be enemies. The letters home became both a lifeline and a source of frustration. Greta wrote to her mother every week, carefully crafting words that would pass the censors while still conveying the truth of her experience. She described the food, the medical care, the kindness of the nurses. She tried to explain how her baby was thriving, how she herself was healthier than she had been in years. Her mother's responses, when they came through the Red Cross mail system weeks later, revealed utter disbelief. "You must be exaggerating to avoid worrying me," her mother wrote in March. "No country treats its prisoners so well. Perhaps you are in a special camp, a propaganda facility meant to impress international observers. Be careful, my darling girl. Do not trust them too completely." But Greta knew this was no propaganda facility. There were no observers, no photographers, no performances for outside audiences. This was simply how the Americans treated pregnant prisoners, with competence, with resources, and with a matter-of-fact decency that assumed human beings deserved proper care, regardless of which flag they had served. By April, Ilse was in her 9th month, days away from delivery. She had grown enormous, her belly so large she could barely walk without assistance. Captain Brennan had her admitted to the hospital ward for monitoring, a precaution that would have been unthinkable in Germany, where hospital beds were desperately scarce. Greta visited her friend every afternoon after work. They sat together in the bright, clean hospital room, so different from the dim, overcrowded wards Greta remembered from Berlin. White walls, proper lighting, the smell of disinfectant rather than blood and suffering. "I'm frightened," Ilse admitted one afternoon, her hand resting on her belly. "Not of them," she added quickly. "Of the pain, of something going wrong, of not being strong enough." "You are strong enough," Greta assured her, "and you are not alone. You have doctors, nurses, medicine. You have everything you need." The words felt strange in her mouth, comforting an enemy prisoner by reminding her of the care provided by their captors. But it was true. Ilse had every advantage that modern medicine could provide, delivered by a nation that had every reason to treat them poorly, but chose instead to treat them well. When Ilse went into labor 3 days later, the entire ward mobilized. Nurses moved with calm efficiency. Lieutenant Whitmore arrived within minutes, along with a second doctor Greta had not seen before. They spoke in low, confident voices, monitoring Ilse's progress, offering encouragement, administering pain relief. Greta waited outside the delivery room with the other pregnant prisoners, listening to the sounds filtering through the door. Ilse's cries of pain, then effort, then finally, after what felt like hours but was only 40 minutes, the sharp, clear wail of a newborn baby. Dorothy emerged moments later, her face flushed with joy. "A girl," she announced. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Mother and baby are both healthy." The German women embraced each other, crying with relief and happiness. One of them, a young woman named Anna, who was 6 months pregnant, whispered what they were all thinking. They kept their promise. They let her keep the baby. Later that evening, Greta was allowed to visit. She found Ilse propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft white blanket. The baby was perfect, with a cap of dark hair and a scrunched, angry face as she slept. "Her name is Maria," Ilse said softly, "after my grandmother, Maria Elizabeth." Greta reached out and gently touched the baby's tiny hand. The fingers curled reflexively around her own. This child, born behind barbed wire in enemy territory, had received better care at birth than most babies born in the heart of the Reich. She had been delivered by skilled doctors in a sterile environment with access to emergency interventions if needed. Her mother had received pain medication, monitoring, and immediate postnatal care. And now, instead of being taken away, Maria would stay with her mother. She would be nursed, held, and raised by Ilse until the war ended and they could go home together. As Greta walked back to her barracks that night, 8 months pregnant herself now, she carried with her a truth that was both liberating and devastating. The enemy had shown her more humanity than her own leaders ever had. The nation she had been taught to hate had given her hope, health, and the promise that she, too, would be allowed to keep her baby when the time came. The propaganda had called Americans monsters, but the monsters had turned out to be healers, and that reality was reshaping everything Greta thought she knew about the world. The world shrank to pain and breathing, contractions that built like waves and crashed through Greta's body with relentless force. It was late May of 1944, 3 weeks before her due date, when her water broke during breakfast. Dorothy had been beside her within seconds, calm and efficient, guiding her to a wheelchair while other nurses cleared a path to the hospital. Now, 6 hours later, Greta lay in the delivery room gripping the metal rails of the bed, sweat soaking her hair, her entire body focused on the impossible task of bringing a child into a world at war. Lieutenant Whitmore stood at the foot of the bed, his hands steady, his voice a constant anchor in the storm of pain. "You're doing beautifully, Greta," he said. "The baby's head is crowning. On the next contraction, I need you to push with everything you have." Dorothy held her hand, counting through the breaths they had practiced for months. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. You're so strong. You're almost there." Another contraction seized her, and Greta pushed, her voice tearing into a scream that she barely recognized as her own. The pressure was unbearable, impossible, and then suddenly it released in a rush of relief so profound, she sobbed. "She's here," Lieutenant Whitmore announced, his voice warm with triumph. "You have a daughter, Greta." The baby's cry filled the room, strong and indignant, and Greta felt tears streaming down her face. Through the haze of exhaustion, she watched as nurses cleaned and wrapped her child in a soft flannel blanket. Then, Dorothy was placing the baby in her arms, and Greta was looking down at a tiny, perfect face, red and wrinkled and impossibly beautiful. "Hello, Anna," she whispered, using the name she had carried in her heart since before she even knew she was pregnant. "Hello, my little one." The baby quieted at her voice, dark eyes blinking open, unfocused but searching. Greta touched the soft curve of her daughter's cheek, traced the delicate fingers that curled against the blanket. This was real. Her baby was alive, healthy, and in her arms. The nightmare she had feared for 9 months had not come to pass. Lieutenant Whitmore approached, his expression gentle. "She's perfect, Greta. 6 pounds, 8 ounces. All 10 fingers, all 10 toes. Strong lungs, as you can hear. We'll monitor both of you for the next few days, but everything looks excellent." "I can keep her?" Greta asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Even now, even after watching Ilse with Maria for the past 6 weeks, part of her still waited for the other shoe to drop, for someone to explain that this had all been temporary, that the babies would be taken after all. Dorothy squeezed her shoulder. "Of course you can keep her. She's your daughter. You'll nurse her, care for her, raise her until you can take her home to Germany when the war ends." The words settled over Greta like a benediction. She pulled Anna closer, feeling the warm weight of her child against her chest, and wept with relief that bordered on disbelief. Over the following weeks, as Greta recovered and learned the exhausting rhythms of new motherhood, 3 more babies were born in the camp. Margaret delivered a healthy boy she named Thomas in early June. Anna, the young woman who had wept on the ship crossing the Atlantic, gave birth to twin girls in July, naming them Sophie and Emma after her sisters back home. Each delivery followed the same pattern: professional medical care, pain management when needed, and afterward, mothers keeping their babies without question or hesitation. The camp administration had anticipated this. By August of 1944, a nursery had been established in a building adjacent to the hospital. It was equipped with cribs, changing tables, rocking chairs, and shelves stocked with supplies that left the German mothers speechless. Cloth diapers by the hundreds, washed and sterilized daily by camp laundry. Powdered formula for mothers whose milk didn't come in or wasn't sufficient. Glass bottles with rubber nipples, baby blankets soft and clean. Tiny undershirts and gowns in multiple sizes, even toys, simple rattles and soft dolls that American Red Cross volunteers had donated. Greta sat in the nursery one afternoon in late August, nursing Anna while Ilse changed Maria's diaper nearby. The room smelled of talcum powder and warm milk, sounds of babies cooing and fussing creating a gentle domestic symphony. Through the window, Greta could see the camp fence, the guard towers, the reminders that they were still prisoners. But inside this room, surrounded by the trappings of ordinary motherhood, it was easy to forget. "My mother wrote again," Ilse said quietly, fastening Maria's diaper and lifting her daughter into her arms. "She doesn't believe me about the formula. She thinks I'm lying to make her feel better. She says there's no formula in all of Berlin, that mothers are trying to nurse their babies while they themselves are starving." The guilt was a constant undercurrent in their lives. Every can of formula, every clean diaper, every moment of professional medical care highlighted the disparity between their situation and that of their families at home. Greta's mother had written in July describing how they now ate grass soup, boiled weeds from the parks because there was nothing else. She had lost 30 pounds. Greta's younger sister, only 14, was being trained to operate anti-aircraft guns because there were no men left. And here was Greta, a prisoner of war, nursing her healthy baby in a warm room, her own body recovering well because she had access to nutritious food and medical care. The arithmetic of it was devastating. "We didn't ask for this," Greta said finally, the words inadequate but necessary. "We didn't ask to be treated better than our own people." "No," Ilse agreed, "but it makes me wonder what kind of nation has so much that even its prisoners want for nothing. And what kind of nation we were serving that couldn't even feed its children." The question hung between them, dangerous and undeniable. The American soldiers and staff seemed to view the babies with a mixture of bemusement and protective affection. Guards who had initially maintained strict professional distance found themselves softening in the presence of infants. One young soldier from Georgia, barely 20 years old, admitted to Dorothy that little Anna reminded him of his niece back home. Doesn't seem right, does it? He had said, watching Greta walk with Anna along the camp's interior paths. Her being born here, in all this mess. But at least she's got a chance, I suppose. Better chance than most babies being born in Europe right now. The gifts started arriving in September. Small things at first. A hand-carved wooden rattle that one of the guards had made in the workshop. A soft knitted blanket from a nurse's mother who had heard about the German babies. A mobile made from painted wooden birds that hung above the cribs in the nursery, spinning slowly in the breeze from the open windows. Captain Brennan supervised these donations carefully, ensuring nothing inappropriate passed into the prisoner's hands, but she allowed what she deemed harmless expressions of goodwill. These children didn't start the war, she said firmly, when one officer questioned whether enemy babies deserve such treatment. And we are not in the business of punishing infants for their parents' nationality. By October, the nursery housed 6 babies, Anna, Maria, Thomas, twins Sophie and Emma, and a boy named Friedrich, whose mother, Clara, had arrived pregnant from a camp in Ohio. The women had formed a tight community, sharing the challenges and small joys of motherhood under extraordinary circumstances. They took turns watching each other's children so mothers could shower or rest. They exchanged advice about feeding schedules and sleep patterns. They sang German lullabies in the evening, their voices soft and melancholic, singing their children to sleep, with songs from a homeland that seemed increasingly distant and strange. Lieutenant Whitmore visited the nursery regularly, checking on the babies' development, weighing them, examining them for any signs of illness or distress. He had become something more than just their doctor. He was the man who had safely delivered most of their children, who had stayed up through the night when Thomas had colic, who had taught them how to recognize the signs of childhood illnesses and when to seek help immediately. One afternoon in November, he sat with Greta as she fed Anna a bottle. The baby was 6 months old now, growing plump and healthy, her dark hair beginning to curl. "She's thriving," he said, making notes in his medical chart. 16 pounds, perfectly on track for her age. You're doing an excellent job with her." "Because you gave me everything I needed," Greta replied, her English much improved after months of daily practice. "The food, the medicine, the help. In Germany, I could not do this alone." Lieutenant Whitmore was quiet for a moment, then set down his pen. "Greta, can I ask you something? And please, feel free not to answer if it makes you uncomfortable." She nodded, curiosity overcoming caution. "Do you understand why we're doing this? Why we're providing this level of care to you and the other mothers?" Greta considered the question carefully. It was something she had discussed with the other women many times, usually late at night when the babies were asleep and they could speak freely. They had developed theories that it was required by international law, that Americans were simply wealthy enough not to notice the expense, that it was a propaganda tool, though for whom they couldn't determine since no photographers or journalists ever visited, that it was some elaborate psychological trick they hadn't yet figured out. But sitting here with Lieutenant Whitmore, who had guided her through labor and checked on her daughter every week since, Greta found herself speaking a truth she had been reluctant to acknowledge. "I think," she said slowly, "you do it because you believe it is right. Not because you must, but because you choose to. Because you see us as human beings, even though we are your enemy." Lieutenant Whitmore smiled, a sad, tired expression that aged his face. "My wife is pregnant," he said. "Our first child. She's due in January. And every time I deliver a baby here, every time I check on these little ones, I think about my own child coming into the world. I think about how I would want someone to treat my wife if our situations were reversed. If America had lost, if she were a prisoner somewhere, pregnant and afraid." He paused, looking at Anna, who had fallen asleep in Greta's arms. "These babies didn't ask to be born into war. They didn't ask to be born behind barbed wire. The least we can do is give them a fighting chance." Greta felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Your child will be very lucky," she said quietly, "to have a father who understands that enemies are still human." The conversation stayed with her for days afterward. She shared it with Ilsa, with the other mothers, and it became part of the story they told themselves about their strange existence. They were prisoners cared for by people who recognized their humanity. They were mothers protected by men who thought of their own wives and children. They were enemies being shown a kind of mercy that none of them had been taught to expect or even believe possible. As winter approached and 1944 drew to a close, news from Europe grew darker. The Allied forces were pushing into Germany, cities were falling, the Reich was collapsing. The women received fewer letters from home, and those that came through described devastation beyond imagination. Greta's mother wrote in December that their apartment building had been destroyed in a bombing raid. She and Greta's sister were living in a shelter, sharing one room with 6 other families, surviving on Red Cross food parcels. Greta read the letter while Anna played on a blanket at her feet, well-fed and warm, surrounded by toys. The guilt nearly broke her. Her mother was homeless, starving, living in the ruins of a defeated nation. And Greta was here, safe, healthy, her daughter thriving, all of it provided by the very forces that had reduced Berlin to rubble. "I cannot reconcile it," she told Dorothy that evening as the nurse helped her prepare Anna for bed. "How can they bomb my home and feed my daughter? How can they destroy my city and give me medicine? Who does such things?" Dorothy was quiet as she folded tiny nightgowns, her movements practiced and sure. Finally she spoke. "I don't think there's an easy answer to that, Greta. War is terrible. People die, cities fall, and there's no making that okay. But I think," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I think that's exactly why we do this. Because in the middle of all that death and destruction, we can still choose to protect life where we find it. We can still choose to show mercy to the innocent. Your baby didn't bomb anyone. She's just a child who deserves a chance to grow up." "Even though she is German?" Greta asked. "Even though her mother served the Reich?" "Even then," Dorothy said firmly, "especially then. Because if we can show mercy to our enemies' children, maybe there's hope that someday this kind of war won't happen again. Maybe these babies will grow up remembering that people can choose kindness even in the darkest times." That night, holding Anna as she slept, Greta found herself praying for the first time since childhood, not to Hitler, not to the Reich, but to something older and more fundamental. She prayed for her mother and sister, for their survival in the ruins of Berlin. She prayed for Dorothy and Lieutenant Whitmore, for their kindness to be repaid somehow. She prayed for her daughter, that Anna would grow up in a world where no child had to be born behind barbed wire. And she prayed that she would find a way to live with the knowledge that her enemies had shown her more humanity than her own leaders ever had, and that this truth, once accepted, could never be unlearned. Knowledge, once gained, could never be unlearned. This truth sat heavy in Greta's chest as she stood in Captain Brennan's office in May of 1945. Anna balanced on her hip, listening to words that should have brought joy, but instead carried the weight of impossible complexity. "The war in Europe is over," Captain Brennan said, her voice gentle but firm. "Germany has surrendered. Within the next few months, you and the other mothers will be processed for repatriation. You'll be going home." Home. The word felt strange in Greta's mouth, almost meaningless. What was home now? The apartment building that no longer existed, the Berlin her mother described in letters, a city of rubble and starvation? Or was it this room, this camp, where Anna had been born and where Greta had learned that the enemy could show mercy? Around her, the other mothers received the same news with similar mixed emotions. Ilse held Maria, now 13 months old and walking, her face pale with uncertainty. Margaret clutched 2-year-old Thomas, tears streaming down her cheeks. Clara stood frozen, baby Friedrich asleep in her arms, her expression unreadable. The preparations for return began immediately, and with them came complications no one had fully anticipated. The babies born in America presented unique bureaucratic challenges. They had been born on American soil to foreign prisoners of war. Questions of citizenship, documentation, and legal status tangled in red tape that took months to unsnarl. Lieutenant Whitmore spent hours helping the mothers navigate the paperwork, his patience inexhaustible as he explained forms that meant nothing to women who had never dealt with such administrative complexities. Birth certificates had to be issued, with Pennsylvania, United States listed as place of birth. Special travel documents were required for the infants. Medical records had to be compiled and translated into German for doctors who would take over their care. "Your daughter is technically eligible for American citizenship," Lieutenant Whitmore explained to Greta during one of these sessions. She was born here. But given the circumstances, and your status as prisoners being repatriated, the situation is complicated. For now, she'll travel as a German national under your custody. If she ever wants to claim American citizenship later, these documents will provide proof of her birth here. Greta looked down at the papers, at Anna's name written in neat English script. Anna Elizabeth Fisher, born May 23, 1944, Pennsylvania, USA. Her daughter, born in enemy territory, documented and protected by the same government that had defeated her homeland. The emotional farewells began, weeks before the actual departure. Dorothy had been reassigned to a hospital in Texas, and on her last day at the camp in July, she came to say goodbye to the mothers and babies she had cared for. She held Anna for a long time, tears running freely down her face, whispering things Greta couldn't quite hear. When she finally handed the baby back, she pressed an envelope into Greta's hands. "My address," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Please write to me. Let me know how she grows, what kind of person she becomes. I need to know that you're both all right." "You saved her life," Greta said, the words inadequate for the depth of gratitude she felt. "You saved both our lives. I will never forget you." They embraced, two women who should have been enemies, bound together by the intimate experience of bringing children safely into a world at war. Dorothy kissed Anna's forehead one last time, then turned and walked away quickly, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Lieutenant Whitmore's goodbye came in August, just days before the women were scheduled to leave. He examined each baby one final time, weighing them, checking their development, writing detailed medical summaries for German doctors to review. When he finished with Anna, he smiled that warm, sad smile Greta had come to know so well. "She's perfect," he said, "healthy, bright, developing beautifully. You've done wonderfully with her, Greta. I know the journey ahead will be difficult, but she's strong. You both are." Greta found herself unable to speak, emotion closing her throat. This man had delivered her daughter, had checked on her countless times, had answered her panicked questions at 3 in the morning when Anna had colic. He had treated her not as a prisoner, but as a patient, deserving of the same care he would give anyone. Finally, she managed, "Your baby, your wife. Are they well?" His face lit up. "A boy, Robert. Born in January, healthy and loud. My wife says he has my stubbornness." He paused, then added quietly, "Every time I look at him, I think of all of you. I think of these children born in such strange circumstances, and I hope someone would have shown my wife the same kindness if our situations were reversed." "They would not have," Greta said, the truth escaping before she could soften it. "If your wife had been a prisoner in Germany, pregnant, they would not have treated her as you treated us. I know this. We all know this." Lieutenant Whitmore nodded slowly. "I know that too. But that's not who we are. And maybe that's the whole point." The ship that took them back to Europe in September of 1945 was crowded with repatriating prisoners, mostly men, thin and tired and eager to return home. The women with babies were given a separate section, bunks close together, some privacy for nursing and changing. The voyage was rough, autumn storms tossing the ship, and many of the children cried from the constant motion. Greta stood on deck 1. Evening as they neared the European coast, Anna wrapped in a blanket against the cold wind. The baby was 16 months old now, babbling in a mix of German and the English words she had picked up from the nurses. "Mama, eat more, mine." She was healthy, curious, fearless in the way of children who had never known hunger or real fear. Beside her, Ilse held Maria, now walking confidently and chattering in full sentences. "Do you think they'll understand?" Ilse asked quietly. "Back home, when we try to explain what it was like?" Greta shook her head. "No. How could they? How can we tell them that the enemy fed us better than our own government, that we received medical care unavailable in Berlin, that American soldiers brought gifts for German babies?" She paused, watching the dark water. "They'll think we were in some special propaganda camp, that our experience was an exception designed to impress international observers." "But it wasn't," Ilse said firmly. "There were no observers, no cameras, just medical protocols and Geneva Convention requirements that they followed because they chose to, not because anyone was watching." "I know," Greta replied. But that truth is dangerous. It means everything we were taught about America was a lie. It means we were fighting for leaders who valued us less than our enemies did. Who will want to hear that? The question had no answer, so they stood in silence, watching Europe draw closer with each passing hour, carrying their healthy American-born babies toward an uncertain future. The destruction awaiting them in Germany was beyond anything Greta had imagined. The ship docked in Bremen, but Bremen barely existed anymore. The city was a landscape of rubble, entire blocks reduced to piles of brick and twisted metal. Survivors moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, wearing clothes held together with patches and wire. The processing center was in a partially destroyed warehouse, drafty and cold despite the September weather. Officials checked their documents, registered their return, and provided instructions for reaching their hometowns. Many of the women broke down when they learned what had become of their families. Husbands dead at the front, parents killed in bombings, siblings missing, displaced, or starving in refugee camps. Greta's mother and sister were alive, living in a single room in what had once been a school, now converted to emergency housing for displaced families. The journey from Bremen to Berlin took 3 days on damaged railways, trains stopping and starting, sometimes reversing course when tracks were impassable. Greta sat in a crowded compartment holding Anna, who whimpered from hunger and discomfort, surrounded by other refugees who stared at her healthy baby with expressions that mixed wonder and resentment. An old woman finally spoke what others were clearly thinking. "Your child is fat," she said bluntly. "Where were you during the war?" "America," Greta replied quietly. "I was a prisoner in America." The woman's eyes widened. "And they fed you? They let you keep the baby?" "Yes." Silence fell over the compartment. No one seemed to know how to respond to this information. It violated everything they had been told about American prison camps, about how the enemy treated captives. Finally, a young man, missing his left arm, spoke bitterly. "We were told they were monsters, that they tortured prisoners, starved them. But your baby is healthier than any child I've seen in Germany in 3 years." Greta had no answer that wouldn't sound like betrayal of everything they had suffered while she had been safe and fed behind barbed wire in Pennsylvania. When she finally reached her mother in Berlin, the reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking. Her mother had aged 20 years and 3, her hair completely gray, her body skeletal, her teeth loose from malnutrition. Greta's sister, now 17, looked like a stranger, hollow-cheeked and hard-eyed, wearing a man's coat 3 sizes too large. They stared at Greta, then at Anna, taking in the baby's round cheeks, bright eyes, and healthy weight. Greta watched understanding dawn on their faces, saw the question they were too proud to ask directly. "How are you so healthy? How is your baby thriving when children are dying of starvation all around us?" "The Americans," Greta said finally, unable to bear the silence. "They gave me food, medical care, everything I needed. They treated me according to the Geneva Convention, better than the Geneva Convention required." Her mother's face crumpled. "And we were eating grass soup and sleeping in bomb shelters while our leaders told us we were winning, that God favored our cause, that the enemy were subhuman monsters." She reached out to touch Anna's cheek with a trembling hand. "Your daughter was born in enemy hands and treated better than German children born in the Reich's capital. What does that tell us about who we were fighting for?" The question hung in the air, dangerous and undeniable, the same question Greta had been carrying since the day she stepped off the transport ship in America and found mercy where she expected cruelty. The weeks and months that followed were among the hardest of Greta's life. Germany in late 1945 and into 1946 was a nation in ruins, struggling with starvation, homelessness, and the complete collapse of infrastructure. The contrast between her imprisonment and her freedom was stark and cruel. As a prisoner, she had eaten 3,200 calories per day. As a free woman in Berlin, she was lucky to receive 1,100. Anna began to lose weight, her round cheeks hollowing as Greta's milk dried up from her own malnutrition. The formula that had been abundant in Pennsylvania was impossible to find. Diapers had to be made from torn sheets and newspapers. The blankets the American Red Cross had provided became their most valuable possessions. Desperate, Greta remembered Dorothy's address. She wrote a letter, not knowing if it would even reach America, explaining their situation. 3 months later, a package arrived, having somehow navigated the chaos of post-war mail systems. Inside were cans of powdered formula, vitamin supplements, baby clothes, and a letter from Dorothy. "My dear Greta," it read, "I think of you and Anna every day. I'm so glad my letters reached you. I've enclosed what I could gather. I know it's not much, but I hope it helps. Please write again and let me know what you need. The war is over, but that doesn't mean we stop caring for each other." Greta wept over that letter, over the cans of formula that would keep her daughter alive, over the kindness of a woman who had every reason to consider her an enemy, but chose instead to see her as a friend in need. Other mothers from the camp had similar experiences. Ilsa received packages from a nurse in Ohio. Margaret maintained correspondence with Lieutenant Whitmore, who sent medical advice and supplies for Thomas. Clara received letters from the young guard from Georgia, who had carved the wooden rattle, asking after Friedrich and including small amounts of money to help with his care. These connections, forged in the strange intimacy of captivity, survived the war's end and became lifelines for women struggling to raise their children in a devastated homeland. The irony was not lost on any of them. American strangers were keeping their children alive while the German government that had once commanded their loyalty was nowhere to be found. As the years passed, the children born in American prison camps grew up with unique stories. Anna would eventually learn that she had been born in Pennsylvania, delivered by an American military doctor, cared for by nurses who brought her gifts and sang her lullabies in English. The knowledge shaped her understanding of the world in profound ways. In 1963, when Anna was 19 years old, she applied for and received American citizenship based on her birth in Pennsylvania. 2 years later, she immigrated to the United States, settling in Philadelphia, not far from where she had been born. She found Dorothy, now retired and living in New Jersey, and the two women who had bonded over her birth maintained a close relationship until Dorothy's death in 1987. Maria, Thomas, Friedrich, Sophie, Emma, and the dozens of other babies born in American POW camps had similar trajectories. Many immigrated to America as adults. They married Americans, built careers, raised families, and carried with them the story of how they had been born behind barbed wire and shown mercy by people who could have chosen cruelty. The statistical legacy was just as remarkable as the personal ones. Records from the camps revealed that maternal mortality rates among German prisoners in American custody were less than 1% compared to rates exceeding 5% in Germany during the same period. Infant mortality among babies born in the camps was under 2%, while in Germany it had climbed above 8% by 1945. These numbers told a story that no propaganda could erase. The enemy had protected German mothers and babies more effectively than the Reich itself had protected its own citizens. Greta lived until 2001, dying at the age of 79 in a small apartment in Berlin with Anna, now a successful businesswoman living in America, by her side. In her final days, she often spoke about her time as a prisoner, about the people who had shown her kindness when they could have shown cruelty. "They could have treated us terribly," she told Anna during one of those last conversations. "They could have let us starve, taken you away from me, punished us for being on the wrong side. No one would have blamed them. We were the enemy. But they chose differently. They chose to see us as human beings, as mothers and children who deserved basic dignity regardless of the flag we had served." She paused, her breath labored, but her mind still sharp. That choice, that simple choice to treat enemies with humanity, did more to defeat everything the Reich stood for than any bomb or bullet, because it proved that all the propaganda was lies. It proved that strength and mercy were not opposites. It proved that a nation confident in its values didn't need to dehumanize its enemies to defeat them. Anna held her mother's hand, thinking about the photographs in the album they had compiled over the years. Pictures of Dorothy, Lieutenant Whitmore, Captain Brennan, the camp where she had been born. Images of a moment in history when humanity had survived in the most unlikely of places. "You were allowed to keep me," Anna said softly, echoing the title of the story her mother had told and retold throughout her life. "They let you keep your baby." "Yes," Greta whispered. In the middle of the worst war the world had ever seen, they let us keep our babies. And in doing so, they taught us what real strength looks like. Not the strength to destroy, but the strength to protect. Not the strength to hate, but the strength to show mercy even to those who had tried to destroy you. She closed her eyes, a small smile on her face. Your generation needs to remember that lesson, Anna. The babies that were allowed to live became living proof that humanity could survive even in total war. We are the witnesses to what happens when a nation is strong enough to be merciful. Don't let the world forget that. 3 days later, Greta passed away peacefully in her sleep. At her funeral, attended by family and friends from both Germany and America, Anna read from one of Dorothy's letters, written in 1946. The babies born in our camp will grow up knowing that even in darkness, there were people who chose light. Even in hatred, there were people who chose love. Even in war, there were people who chose to protect life. That knowledge is more powerful than any weapon, and those children will carry it forward into a future we can only hope will be better than our past. Anna looked out at the gathered mourners, at the children and grandchildren of women who had been prisoners together, at Americans and Germans united in grief and remembrance, and understood that her mother's story was not just about survival. It was about transformation, about how treating even your enemies with dignity could reshape the world in ways that military victory alone never could. The babies that had been allowed to live grew up to become bridges between nations, living testaments to the idea that humanity could triumph over ideology, that mercy could prove stronger than propaganda, and that the simple act of letting a mother keep her child could echo across generations. In the arithmetic of war, where everything was calculated in weapons and casualties, victories and defeats, these women and their children represented an equation that didn't fit traditional military logic. They were the proof that America's greatest strength had never been just its industrial might or its military power. It had been its willingness to extend humanity even to those who had sworn to destroy it. That lesson, learned behind barbed wire in Pennsylvania by frightened German women who discovered mercy where they expected cruelty, became a legacy that outlived the war itself. A quiet victory that proved more enduring than any battle, because it was built not on the graves of enemies, but on the lives of children who were allowed to survive, to thrive, and to carry forward the memory of a moment when compassion defeated hatred and mercy proved stronger than vengeance.